to be part of the recording, you're welcome to. A quick welcome from me. I'm Lauren. I'm a learning designer at SILT, and I will be presenting this webinar along with Tasneem, who will be sharing his screen. So I will do the quick welcome task. You can go to the next slide. This is a heads up about upcoming webinars that are part of this assessment series. We'll be doing, these ones will start next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. You can sign up for these from the SILT website. I want to point out that we have another designing multiple choice questions webinar on Wednesday that are specifically for health sciences faculty members. So anyone here who are from the health sciences are welcome to come to that one as well. Okay, that's it. And then here we have a list of support that we offer from SILT. There's the help at Villa email that you can ask, you can send any query email to them and they will respond to you. We also have one-on-one help consultations where you sign up 24 hours in advance and you book a consultation with one of the SILT members like myself or Tasneem or anyone who's listed. And then we also have a Zoom room that we are calling drop-in office hours on Fridays between 1:30 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You don't need to book this. The Zoom link will be available. You can click on it and you can pop in. There will be some SILT staff people on call who will be able to assist you with any questions that you might have in the moment. And then go back to us. There's also the help backpack, also the Villa help button that you can access and quickly search for something that you want to know about on your Villa site. Okay, thanks. Next. And then quick outline of this webinar. We will talk about question levels according to Bloom's. We will talk about structuring your quiz, and then we'll look at some of the common question types that are available on Villa. We'll look at some examples, and then we'll end off with a summary and some practical advice on writing questions. Okay. Next up, a quick I'm going to put my camera off so that I'm saving bandwidth. Thank you. Okay, so a quick look at some of the benefits of online quizzes. This is specific to when we consider final assessments, but some of the benefits of online quizzes is that quizzes are flexible. It can be used for lots of different purposes throughout the year, not just a summative assessment. It can be formative and self-study as well. You can make it really secure. There are some things that you need to do to make it more secure. So if it's done right, you can have a secure quiz. It's easier on marking, so we have automatic marking. Some of the online quiz questions require manual marking, but for the most part, it can still be easy. It's effective for measuring a wide range of learning outcomes. We'll talk about that in a bit, but according to the learning outcome levels on Bloom's taxonomy, you can use quizzes for all of these, except for one. And then you can also use it as roadblocks throughout the year to make sure that students are keeping up with the content. And lastly, it's useful for gauging the effectiveness of your course material and whether students are learning what they need to learn. And you can do this by checking the analytics on your course. We do have an item analysis webinar next week that we would like to encourage you to attend to make use of the analytics more effectively. Okay. Now, the first thing that I want to start with is the learning outcomes. And I want to encourage everyone to begin with learning outcomes. So quick look at Bloom's. Um, the most of you are familiar with Bloom's, but I want to go over this very briefly. So the learning outcomes that you have for a particular week or module or lesson can guide you to setting up the type of assessments for students. So Bloom's is a framework that scaffolds learning outcomes in levels of complexity and specificity. And these go from lower order learning to higher order learning. And they're divided in 6 major categories from least complex to most. So they start with remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. And then the learning outcomes that require less complex responses or lower order learning will fall into remember and understand categories. And then higher, more complex responses will be higher order learning, and they will fall into apply, analyze, and evaluate categories. The create category are not really appropriate for online quizzes, but I will go into that in the next slide. So Taz, if you can go into the next one. Right, when we look at these categories of learning outcomes and what can be assessed in each of these, quizzes will be most effective in the first 5 categories. So in the create category, students are required to generate new ideas and products or compile information in a new way. And this won't be appropriate to assess through quizzes. And it's better to test this through written assessments, for example, or where students get to respond in a more appropriate way to this learning outcome. But for understand and remember the lower order learning, quizzes are great for testing these outcomes. And you can also use this when you have large volumes of material. And then for analyze and apply, quizzes are effective as well. If you create the questions with these levels in mind. So the idea is for students to get to the right answer through a more complex process of problem solving or applying their knowledge, rather than simply recalling information as they would in understand or remember. And then to assess learning outcomes in the evaluate category, quizzes generally require a bit more time and effort when you create them, when you create the questions, but they can still be effective to test evaluate learning outcomes. So I know most of you probably already have questions that you've created. And the idea is to scan through them and to get a sense of in which category they fall, and with from lower order learning to higher order learning. And this will give you an idea of how your questions are distributed and whether you might need to focus on creating more higher order learning questions to assess, apply, analyze, and evaluate learning outcomes, for example. This is good to know to make sure that you assess what it is you need to assess in your quiz. Go ahead, Taz. Thank you. So the next step we suggest is to create a structure for your quiz. This is encouraged because it ensures that your quizzes include a variety of questions in each level of learning, in each of these categories. So this is an example that shows a quiz with 4 parts, and these 4 parts cover the categories of learning outcomes. So key concepts would cover understand and remember, the application section, as well as the case study section, would cover the higher order learning, so analyze, apply, analyze, and evaluate. This quiz structure also includes a reflection section where students can provide a written response and where you could assess the create, the learning outcomes in the create category. Now, something that we want to encourage is to create question pools over time. I know we are at the end of the year now, but perhaps this is a good point for going forward. Um, so we can create question pools on Vula and then draw from them when you need to create a quiz. These can be added randomly by setting up your test and quizzes. And we will have a webinar next week specifically on question pools and randomization. Before we go over to Taz's part of the webinar, do we have any questions that anyone would like to ask? Or is there anything in the chat? Nothing in the chat. Any questions from anyone? You're welcome to unmute and ask it if you would like to.
I have a question for the participants.
Mm-hmm.
In your preparation for your previous tests or exams, have you like planned a structure like this before starting your quiz design? Maybe you can pop a comment in the chat or put on your mic. And is this possibly useful in your future planning of quizzes to break this down and see what level you're testing at and how many questions you're creating for each section?
Or perhaps even to go back, so people might have a whole lot of questions already, but maybe to go back and divide them into different sections to have an idea of how they're distributed. That could be helpful as well. So we have some people who haven't done this. Okay. Great. This is good to know. Thank you, everybody. And we hope this is useful, but it doesn't have to be a rigid sort of rule to follow in terms of these sections and dividing questions into learning outcome categories. But it's a framework to keep in mind, I suppose, more than something to follow to the T. Okay. Sabelo has a comment. 2 minutes per mark. So how do I make sure my student don't spend 5 minutes for 1 mark? That is a good question. And yeah, we from our side, we don't have a specific rule to follow for that. We have a general idea that students should spend 1 to 2 minutes per mark, and then add a few minutes for grace time. But
Can I add here? So it's very hard to make like a recommendation that only 1 minute or only 2 minutes, because it honestly comes down to the complexity of your content. So all of you have different levels and years and content, and it's very difficult to say. Someone might have a very complicated calculation question. Some might just be a definition. And obviously you would assign different marks to depending on complexity. But the one way of perhaps testing that is actually having you go through the entire quiz as a student, and you probably would need to multiply your time by twice or thrice the amount of time that you take, or have a tutor or someone else actually go through your test to see how long it's taking them. So that's one way you can do that. It's quite a lengthy process, but it's very hard to just apply like one rule to it. Does anyone else have ideas about how they do that? How you assign minutes per mark for the quizzes you have previously done?
But this is Patricia speaking.
Hi.
If you have a long, complicated calculation, you would assign it more marks. So then the minutes per mark would still hold?
Yes, possibly. And it is sort of like a guideline used by some, but it's really hard to say that that is something you should apply just across the board. It is contextual.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We can move on, Paz. So it's over to you now. There you go.
Cool. So I'm just going to go briefly through some of the popular question types. And some of you may have used some of this in your quizzes before or might want to use it. And I'm going to go through these before we get into actual MCQ, writing MCQ design. So if you've gone into Vula, you've seen that when you create a new question, you get this huge list of question options that you could create your quiz with. I'm not sure which options you've used so far and which options you like. Maybe you want to pop that in the chat. And I'll go through some of the benefits and considerations of some of these options. So if we're thinking about designing our quizzes, often the most popular question type is just an MCQ with 4 options and 1 answer. That would be the typical question type, and it's quite simple and easy to set up. It is really hard to design a good multiple choice question, but it's the easiest one to design across the different levels of learning. Then EMI is extended matching items, and I'll show you a screenshot of that in a little bit. But that is a slightly more complex multiple choice question, and is often actually used in health sciences or clinical scenarios. And I have a good example of that. So it offers the benefits for EMI is it reduces guessing, and then there's less work for you to create multiple questions on a similar topic. It probably does take you quite a bit of time to create these questions, and also it will take quite a bit of time for the student to read the question. So it might be a little bit complex to calculate the time a student should spend on that question. Another consideration is that you can't upload extended matching questions using text markup. So if you came to yesterday's session, we showed you how to upload your questions in bulk to Vula. There's also true and false, which is commonly used, but it does only test lower levels of understanding, and it encourages guessing. So if you wanted to test higher order thinking and applied scenarios, true and false, it's harder to make that work. Then you have hotspot questions, which is for if you have an image and you want students to identify different areas. It does require very careful setting up because it can go wrong. Other question types we have is matching questions, text or numeric responses, survey matrix, calculated questions, and short answer questions. So we'll share the slides so you can go through the benefits and considerations afterwards. But I would say the most common types in terms of like a summative class test or exam is your one answer MCQs or multiple answer MCQs and short answer questions. I'm not sure what else you've all used so far in terms of your bigger class tests or your exam oriented stuff. I'm just going through some visuals of some of the question types. So this would be your one answer MCQ, which is probably the most common type, which is typically like 4 options or 5 options with 1 answer or multiple answers. Then we also have a survey matrix, which is also a question type you could use, but I will caution you in terms of marking. So if you do use this question type, you will have to manually grade this question. So this example of that. You have matching questions if you want people to match, for example, on the left-hand side. If you wanted someone to, if you have something in your course where there's a step-by-step process that needs to be followed to achieve an outcome, then the matching question could be something that you use to test that. You could also, on the right-hand side, use a numeric input option if you have an equation for people to calculate. And this is extended matching items. And I want to spend a tiny bit of time on you. It is a little bit complex. And I'm not sure if you've used extended matching items. Could you pop that in the chat? I want to see. But basically, it's like a slightly more complex normal multiple choice question. So it's mostly used in health scenarios, but I do think it could be used in different departments that use sort of case study based or real world scenarios. I see someone in the chat uses it frequently. So for example, a theme for this question would be fatigue. And that could be a symptom of many different diagnoses. So your options A to I could list the various options as a result of the symptom of fatigue. And then after that, you have something called a lead-in statement. So you're basically going to list various scenarios of people that have fatigue with different conditions, and students have to basically choose an option from their list and assign it to each of the scenarios. So I know health sciences use quite a lot, but I do think that anyone who's using sort of case study scenarios in their course could think about how this could work for them. So on Vula, you could only assign options to each of the questions. You can't actually provide like there's no box for like a rationale or comment, but I'm sure there's a workaround for that. Yeah, so if anyone's to list the pros of using EMIs and how it's worked for you in terms of testing, you can pop that in the chat. I think your insight will be of value. Another question is hotspots. So if you have a course that teaches diagrams of various particular areas, you could use that. Again, this is mostly quite commonly used in health sciences, but definitely can be used in terms of any course that has a diagram. It's quite particular though, because you have to select the shaded area where students have to select, and that would be classified as the right answer. So you do have to spend quite a lot of time setting this up to ensure that you get it as accurate as possible and students don't accidentally click out of the area and then get it incorrect. Students also can receive partial credit for a question type like this. Then another common option is short answer questions. If you use short answer questions on testing quizzes, it won't be sent for plagiarism or to turn it in to be checked for plagiarism. So that's something you have to note. And obviously it also has to be manually graded. But if you are having a timed test and you wanted to use short answer questions, in this example, it's sort of a three-parter. So you choose in step one, you choose an artist that was discussed in the course. And then in question two, you choose the period that they were involved in. And in question three, you could probably maybe write an essay based on that question. But it is a bit more complex, and maybe for something like this, Vula assignments might be more suitable. But if you wanted to try something more complex in a time version, this could potentially work. But note that it's not submitted to turn it in. So if any students are copying from each other or copying from the internet, you won't really be able to identify it that easily. I'm just going to pause for a second to see if there's any sort of questions.
Something from Melissa Rose Paz.
Yeah.
About quasi issues. Okay. For certain students, the multiple options applied per statement.
Okay, so if I don't know of that issue. So if you do come across certain issues like that, please send it through to help@Vula so that we can rectify the issue, especially, you know, as we approach an examination period or testing period. So now I'm going to look at some examples of MCQs and identify why it could be a good or a bad question, or in different situations it might be used. I'm going to go through a few examples, and then Lauren at the end will go through the principles of some of the things I've discussed and give you a more comprehensive overview of practical advice when writing MCQs. So this is an example of a question: which of the following is not a fruit? So this uses a common aspect that we commonly tell people to avoid, which is the use of a negative. So we recommend not using negatives because it can be quite confusing to the student, and we also have to take in language barriers of our students. So it takes a lot longer to process a question that has a negative, especially when there's double negatives. So we would recommend avoiding using negatives as it can be confusing. This question also has, indeed, it has none of the above. Absolutes are also to be avoided, as it allows students to identify the correct answer a lot easier. So it encourages it doesn't have any content. It's just an option. Instead of writing the question like this, you could change it to select all of the options below that are fruit. I have heard that some people say they intentionally use negatives in their testing, and they have their reasoning, but yeah. This is another question. When did the Renaissance take place? And the options are dates. If we look at what potentially could be wrong with this, it's quite a low level question. We just testing a period of time. So you would have to ask yourself, is this appropriate to my learning outcome? It has overlapping time periods, which means it'd be quite confusing for students to select the right answer. I said it has different answer type and it's not in the right order. So when you do use something like dates or numbers, you may want to make sure it's in the right order. This is another question type. Which of the following statements is correct? Another version I've seen of this, which of the following statements are not correct? And if we look at why this question may not be a great question, the question type is quite generic. Which of the following statements is correct? There's no theme or topic associated with it, and they don't actually know what they're being tested on. So I know that in questions, when I've done this, it can get a little bit confusing or to figure out what actually I'm trying to answer. It also is a bit harder when your question options or your distractors are like not related at all and they're just on completely different topics. So would recommend rather actually trying to phrase the thing you are testing rather than a generic sort of statement about what is correct or what is not correct, because it could cover the entire course syllabus, you know, a question like this. Another few things to identify here is that the inconsistent usage of the sort of the way the distractors are opened. And then the other thing is that often with MCQs, the longest answer is typically correct. So maybe it's worth reviewing some of the previous questions you've written and to see whether that's actually true for you. I don't know if you found this true for what you've created so far. You can always pop in the chat if you have actually identified this with your own quizzes. And this is probably because it actually is really hard to write good distractors. It's very obviously easy to write the actual answer, but when you're trying to come up with 3 other options that are equally as good and viable, it's really hard. I see there's a question in the chat. Sabella's is asking whether to highlight a negative with like capital letters. Look, if you do really want to use negatives, it might be a good idea to put it in bold. Our first, like Lauren said, our first preference would be to rephrase the question not using a negative, just also to make sure that we don't confuse students too much, and also cater for the language barrier. Because if you are confusing people with a negative, you need to account for the fact that some people need to take longer to think about what the question's actually asking. This is an example of a true and false question. And as we said, that this type of question measures low levels of learning, and that might be okay. So if you are doing a practice quiz or a quiz throughout the semester, that might be fine. But when you're doing a final test or exam, is this what you want to be testing? And that is something only you know. This is another example of a question, and I mentioned this earlier, that if you are using all of the above or none of the above, if the learner can identify a single choice as true, they know that none of the above is not the answer. So it's an easier way to eliminate options from your question. So I want to go into like 2 examples of what does a higher order MCQ actually look like. So as Lauren went through earlier with the blooms and the different levels that we can assess at, this is something really important for you to think about. So in this question, basically the learning outcome is to assess a clinical situation. And the student has to read the scenario about a nurse visiting a patient and make a decision on what they observed based on that information. So they have to apply what they've learned about a theory or about a disease and apply it to the scenario. So this could be classified as a more complex question. And in another example, this learning outcome is to evaluate the most appropriate policies to accomplish a goal. I'm not going to read that whole text, but basically, if you were in a course that was teaching you about policies, you would have to know quite a bit of prior information to know what policy should be used in the situation. So students are using knowledge they have learned to apply and evaluate and make a decision on the most appropriate policy. But as you can see, these higher order MCQs are often a little bit longer and a little bit more complex. So they are quite consuming to write. I often find that if I write an MCQ, a good one, it takes like 30 minutes, to be honest. So yeah. So those are just examples of common things to avoid and maybe what a higher order MCQ looks like. I'm going to hand over, maybe I should pause quickly, but I'm going to hand over to Lauren afterwards to do the sort of comprehensive do's and don'ts when writing MCQs. Are there any questions or comments?
Doesn't look like it has.
Okay, we can carry on.
Okay, let's move on. So I'm going to give a summary of the things that has spoke about now in the examples and what we've said from the beginning of the webinar. I'm first going to go over a couple of do's when writing quizzes, and then what not to do, what to avoid. So first, when writing quizzes, write questions that address the learning outcomes. And this might seem obvious, but it's surprisingly easy to lose sight of what it is that you are trying to assess. And keeping the learning outcomes on hand, so close by, open on your screen, so that you can use them to guide you as you create the quiz. Using something like the quiz structure to divide the questions into different sections will also help you to see in which sections you might be adding way more questions than in other sections. And then create a bank of questions over time to draw from. This is something to do over time. So going into next year, it's something to remember. If you already have a bank of questions, that's great. You can draw from them to create your quizzes. You can also quite quickly create multiple versions of a question by changing one key scenario or one key detail of a scenario to quickly add to your bank of questions. Also let students choose their own cases or scenarios or case study. So it was in one of the examples that has heard earlier. This is a good option to include when you write quizzes. And then create reflective thought answer questions. So this will help you to include more complex questions in your quiz where students can explain their thinking a bit more. It does require manual marking, or if you create rubrics, it will make it a bit quicker. But it's good to add those kinds of questions into your quizzes. And then include questions that have a best answer rather than one correct one, because this would require students to evaluate and rank the options. So it allows you to assess more complex learning outcomes. Sorry. And then, as Taz also mentioned earlier, ask someone to test your quiz, a tutor or a colleague. Let them go through the quiz and see how long they take. Ask them what was confusing, what didn't make sense. The students are likely to experience this as well, and it will help you to eliminate any unforeseen issues in your quiz. And then lastly, consider the time you are allowing to complete the quiz. By having someone test it will help you to make the time that you allow for completion as accurate as possible. As we said earlier, it's hard to recommend a general rule, for example, 1 or 2 minutes per mark. But having someone test the quiz is as accurate as you can get, I suppose. And then next up, times. So some don't, some things to avoid. When writing questions, as we saw, avoid confusing wording and language. This will be unfair to students who have language barriers, so make the language and wording as clear as possible. And then also avoid negatives. And also try not to trick students. If, for example, by adding unnecessary information, this could be seen as a trick question. And I think what would be advisable to do then is to ask, what am I assessing? So if you see that you need to make the question harder by adding unnecessary information, for example, maybe try to create it from scratch so that you really assess what it is that you need to, according to the learning outcome or the topic. And then also when writing questions, avoid generic ones, like we saw in one of the examples. For example, which of the following statements are true? So this is essentially a true or false question, and there are no content in the question. It's a non-content type of statement. And then also avoid unfamiliar terms or abbreviations that students haven't come across before. Even in distractors, this will be easy to see when students are answering quiz questions. And then next up, ties. So when writing answer options, these are items to avoid. As we saw, non-content options, and also ambiguous or overlapping answers, like we saw in the date answer options. Don't let them overlap. And also avoid extremes, such as always, never, or none. And inconsistent answer options, such as varying lengths or varying answer types. Tags, go back. Thank you. And also avoid grammatical inconsistency. So the first word should always be the same type as such as a noun. And lastly, don't scramble options where there is a meaningful order. So if you are using dates, let them be chronological. So that's it. That's it for our summary of what we covered in terms of do's and don'ts. And then go back to the next one. Or onto the next one. Thank you, Taz. So we are also including some resources that you can look at your own time with good examples, and also for people who haven't used EMIs, but there's a good paper on how to use it and how to set it up. And then lastly, what do we have lastly, Taz? This is it. Okay, thank you, everybody. Now that we have covered everything we needed to, we have 10 minutes for questions. So if you have any specific questions about your quizzes that you would like us to cover, please go ahead and ask them now. You can unmute yourself or you can pop it into the chat and we'll see if we can help you out.
There was a comment about if testing quizzes could have a way to include like blooms in the question creation. I'm just looking for it. Yeah, if perhaps allow a feature in pools where one can store info about the question, like the blooms level or discrimination index. So that's the blooms, but is not included, unfortunately, but could be a really cool addition. I hope that was useful. Sorry if the session was a little bit confusing about what it would be. And we have separated MCQs and testing quizzes into quite a few different sessions over this week and next week. I hope it was useful.
So the actual test and quizzes, using test and quizzes will be next week, right, Taz?
Yeah, so next week, I think it's Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, will be if you are planning to set up question pools and randomization in your quizzes, that would be a really good session to attend to get that.
And yesterday's was about using test and quizzes.
Yes, yesterday was about the test and quizzes settings. We will share, once all the webinars are done, we will share hopefully a list of a YouTube playlist that has everything. You can scan through what you need.
Okay, see, so Abigail can go through the webinar recording of yesterday. That might be useful. I'm glad to see